Okay, so in the last lecture, we finished up with, um, Euthyphro and Socrates talking about mythological justification as a means of determining whether or not Euthyphro is doing the right thing. And let's see. And they sort of come to, some interesting conclusions. Socrates says that that appeal is insufficient, basically because, though Zeus might agree that prosecuting your father is justified, that Kronos and Uranus would probably disagree, because Zeus, of course, sort of prosecuted his father or went against his father and made him vomit up his children and tied him up and threw him out of the world, I suppose. And Cronus castrated Uranus, which I'm sure Uranus wasn't all that pleased with either. There's a concept, it's called filial piety, which is the obligation that children have to show their, respect and take care of their parents. And this is kind of in violation of that sort of characteristic or quality. So Socrates keeps pushing Euthyphro, and we come up with, let's see, definition one comes, right, first definition comes, do as I do. And Socrates says, well, that's not helpful, because, he can't use that to try and get him through his trial. So we do the mythological appeal, now we come down to definition two. What is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not is impious. And this is starting to sound like a reasonable definition. So, Socrates wants to know whether what he's done is impious or pious. Well, the way to do that is to try and figure out what it is the gods wanted him to, what the gods like, and how what he did is related to what the gods like. But Socrates is not, he is not convinced that this is quite the right answer. And so this is an interesting philosophical move, because what Socrates is going to do is kind of shift the case of application, the group of application, to more closely correspond to what a reasonable answer. Okay, first he starts out, though, of talking about what kind of thing is piety, right? Can it be measured like weight or numbers? That there's some means of determining whether, by counting or by using a scale to determine, or measuring something, just determine how long something is. But whether or not something is pious, we can't do that kind of comparison. So he says maybe it's like that other stuff that we argue about all the time, which is, what Socrates loves to talk about, like beauty and goodness, justice and badness. And he also notes that the gods are going to disagree about what is beautiful, what is good, what counts as justice, and what counts as badness. So piety is what is dear to the gods, but Socrates points out that the gods disagree a great deal, and in a way that cannot be easily resolved, about what they like and what they don't like. So this is kind of how this argument would go out if it's a little more clearly fleshed out. That which the gods find dear is pious. That which the gods do not find dear or do not like is impious. But the gods disagree. So the same things can be both pious and impious. But Socrates and Euthyphro have already concluded that something cannot be both pious and impious, that these are opposites. So if it were to be the case that something is both pious and impious, a contradiction would result, and that's not logically possible. So this argument has to fail. Now, about the gods disagreeing, any of you who've read Greek mythology, or read the Rick Riordan series about the lightning thief, I believe, and so on and so forth, the Greek gods did not get along. And in the Iliad, the same thing. And the Iliad, which is a description of part of the Trojan Wars, the gods are taking sides with whether or not to go along with Troy or the people trying to get Helen back. I guess Agamemnon and friends. So Hera, for instance, is the goddess of marriage, the goddess of and Zeus sees himself as being, above everybody else in such a way that he ought to be able to sleep around with whoever he wants to, and Hera disagrees. So they're going to have differences of opinion over what constitutes adultery, appropriate or inappropriate. And Ares, god of war, is going to have a difference of opinion about how to respond to military threats with Athena, who is the goddess of defense, and so on. So it's really important that the gods disagree. So how are we going to handle that? So having pointed out this difficulty, Socrates and Euthyphro limit the application of their argument to only those cases that we can argue will fit the bill. So I'm thinking about when you argue with somebody else, is this beautiful? Is that beautiful? Is this delicious, or is that not delicious? Professor I used to work for had a little table party. He would play with 3 tastes, but that's anyway. And you can say, well, tables taste bad, and you can say, okay, well, we're only going to argue about the taste of things that you're supposed to eat. Right? So you limit the application of your argument. So Socrates comes to the conclusion that we really ought to only consider those cases, right, to be clearly where something is pious or impious. The only thing we can really talk about is when the gods agree, right? We can only consider those cases in which all the gods agree that something is dear or not dear. And in this case, dear meaning that they care for it, or they love it, they find it valuable. This is that modification to the argument is still interesting. It's interesting, but it still has a fundamental problem that the original argument had. But now we can get into this particular issue, which is that ultimately this argument, as stated, is circular. If pious things are what all the gods love, and all the gods love what things are pious, then this idea is circular. Okay? Because we say, what do all the gods love? Well, they love pious things. Well, what makes something pious? Well, the gods love it. You haven't really told me anything about what piety is, or how to know whether or not something's pious. Socrates is seeking a universal. What do pious things have in common that can be used to identify them? And you can see how this would be related back to Plato's idea of form, of the form of the thing. In fact, I think they're using, in the text, they use the word forms, or at least in my translation. Now, there is a section here in the reading that's particularly difficult. Right. This is at the bottom of page 12 in the Hackett edition, Stephanus number 10C. And this gives readers and translators fits, because we think that there is something in the language that isn't being expressed in the English translations. And I read, or tried to read rather, somebody whose purpose of being is to translate ancient documents, and there was a great deal of, to me, incoherent, but very well thought out, but very technical problems with translating this particular passage. But we know kind of where they're ultimately going. Socrates is going to say, well, let's split the circle, but we'll get there in just a second. This is just a description of what the general circular reasoning is. You're probably going to run across this, perhaps not, hopefully not this, obviously, but you will in your lifetime as you find people arguing for things. And Socrates notes that things come to get their properties, right? They have to. See, this is what drives me bananas, because it seems to me when read straight, it comes to the opposite conclusion of what Plato and Euthyphro, or Socrates and Euthyphro, are going to come to. Okay. It is not being seen because it is a thing seen, but on the contrary, it is a thing seen because it is being seen. Nor is it because it is something led that it is being led, but because it is being led that it is something led. Okay, so this seems to imply to me that, something becomes seen when it is seen. It is the act of seeing that recognizes or imbues the property of being seen upon it. Something that is being carried. It is not carried because it's being carried, it's carried because it's being carried. But it wasn't in the state of being carried. But it had to be... Anyway, so... This part is a bit tricky. Now, this particular quote down here at the bottom in the notes, why is X carried? Because somebody carries it. It's the appropriate answer. Why does someone carry X? Because it is carried. No, that's not helpful. One seems to act as an explanation of the other, even though they're logically equivalent. Why is X carried? Because someone carries it. Why does somebody carry X? Because it is carried. Wrong. So this is not a perfect circle. And there's a way of looking at this idea that helps to give us a definition of piety. Okay. So Socrates in this work, let's see. Is it being loved because it is pious or for some other reason? And Euthyphro says, for no other reason. It is being loved then because it is pious, but it is not pious because it is being loved. So Euthyphro and Socrates come to a particular conclusion in Euthyphro's dilemma, which is that gods love pious things because they are pious. So are pious things loved by all the gods, or are they pious because they are being loved? Pious things being loved by all the gods. Piety is something that things have as a property independent of the love of the gods, and perhaps it attracts the love of the gods. Sometimes they say it's there are things and acts in the world that smell like strawberries, something very pleasant, and that attracts the love of the gods. But that goodness and piety is something that is imbued upon things in the world, and then the gods love it, and that the piety is already there when the gods love it. This will become clearer. Or is it the case that the gods see things and the gods, oh, I like that, and now that thing becomes pious? Whereas before it was just a thing. So that particular view is something we call divine command theory, which is where things obtain their goodness or their virtue from the love of the gods. And the other position is something called sometimes, moral realism, which is that objects themselves have particular properties that attract the love of the gods, that they possess before the gods love them. So this is a bit I want you to learn. This is where Euthyphro's dilemma, this particular part of the argument, goes beyond this particular dialogue and starts to have implications for our views on Christianity and how goodness is connected to the gods. I'm going to break here and then come back and do this as a separate lecture, but just in another chunk